Easy, easy now. Whoa, steady. We'll get you loose, just hold still.
The spring storms came quickly across the Colorado Rockies, rolling over the mountains like dark ocean waves. We could almost feel the cold wind pushing through the pine trees as thunder echoed across the valleys, sending frightened birds into the gray sky. On mornings like this, most ranchers hurried home before the rain arrived. But Jacob Carter had never been the sort of cowboy to ignore trouble. At 43, Jacob carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his life on horseback. His weathered face, neatly trimmed beard, and calm blue eyes had witnessed enough hardship to know that kindness often mattered more than pride. Beneath his faded black felt hat, he scanned the rolling pasture as his bay horse climbed a rocky trail overlooking the valley. The storm was almost upon him. He tugged gently on the reins. "Easy, boy." The horse slowed. That was when Jacob heard it. Not thunder, not the wind. A desperate, frightened whinny. He immediately turned toward the sound. Again it came. Weak, panicked, somewhere below the ridge. Without hesitation, Jacob guided his horse down the narrow hillside, weaving between juniper trees and scattered boulders, until he reached an abandoned stretch of old fencing, forgotten by most of the county. Then he saw him. A magnificent black stallion struggled violently against rusted barbed wire that had wrapped around one of its front legs. Every attempt to pull free only tightened the cruel metal deeper into its skin. Mud covered its powerful body from the night's rain, and fear burned in its dark eyes. Jacob quickly dismounted. "It's all right." The stallion reared again. "I won't hurt you." Slowly, patiently. Jacob removed his hat and laid it on the grass. He approached with careful steps, speaking softly the way experienced horsemen often did. "We're going to get you out." The frightened animal snorted, ears pinned back. Jacob never rushed. He knew frightened horses trusted calm more than strength. After several long minutes, the stallion finally stopped struggling. Jacob knelt beside the tangled wire. Using the small fencing pliers he always carried on his saddle, he began cutting away each twisted strand, one piece at a time. The work was slow. Rain began falling. Cold drops soaked his trail coat. Still he continued. Nearly an hour passed before the final strand snapped loose. The stallion staggered, but remained standing. Jacob immediately examined the injured leg. The cuts were deep, though thankfully not life-threatening. He removed clean cloth from his saddlebag, washed the wounds with water from his canteen, and wrapped the injured leg as carefully as if he were treating his own horse. "There now." The stallion lowered its head, almost as if it understood. Jacob smiled quietly. "You've got plenty of fight left." Instead of running away, the great horse stayed close beside him. Together they slowly walked toward a nearby abandoned line shack where Jacob could shelter the injured animal from the storm. Hours later, the rain finally eased. Inside the small wooden shelter, Jacob brushed dried mud from the stallion's coat, while the horse peacefully ate fresh hay he had gathered nearby. Only then did Jacob notice the expensive saddle lying across the corner of the shack. It had been thrown aside during the struggle. The leather was finely crafted, far too expensive for an ordinary ranch hand. He carried it to a rough wooden table. The saddle itself needed repair after being dragged across the rocks. Jacob automatically reached for his leather tools. Old habits never left a saddlemaker's son. As he carefully cleaned away layers of mud, something slowly appeared beneath the worn leather flap. A burned cattle brand. Jacob froze. His hands stopped moving. He knew that brand. Everyone in Silver Creek knew it. A large K crossed by a lightning bolt. Victor Kane, the wealthiest cattle baron in 3 counties. The man Jacob had sworn never to help again. Before Jacob could gather his thoughts, footsteps rushed toward the shack. The door burst open. 13-year-old Ben Carter, soaked from the rain, stood breathing hard. His eyes immediately found the stallion, then the saddle, then the burned brand. His face turned pale. "Uncle Jacob." Jacob looked up slowly. Ben swallowed. That's Mr. Kane's horse. Jacob quietly rested one hand against the stallion's neck. The magnificent animal gently leaned into him. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jacob looked at his nephew and said softly, "The horse never chose its owner." At that exact moment, thunder rolled across the valley once more. Ben looked toward the open doorway. His eyes widened. "Uncle?" Jacob turned. On the ridge above the shack, Victor Kane and several armed ranch hands appeared through the mist, galloping straight toward them. We barely had time to breathe before Victor Kane and his riders thundered down the hillside toward the old line shack. Hooves pounded the soaked earth, sending mud flying behind them as lightning flashed above the darkening valley. The black stallion lifted its head, ears forward, but instead of running, it quietly stepped closer to Jacob Carter. Jacob remained exactly where he was. His weathered hand rested calmly against the stallion's neck. Ben Carter swallowed nervously. "Uncle, they're coming fast." Jacob nodded once. "I know." Moments later, Victor Kane reined his powerful chestnut horse to a sharp stop only a few yards from the shack. His expensive black frock coat was splattered with rain, and beneath his polished black hat, his stern gray eyes locked onto the stallion. For a brief instant, relief crossed his face. Then he saw Jacob. The relief vanished. His jaw tightened. "So," Victor said coldly, "I should have guessed." Jacob didn't answer. Victor dismounted slowly, followed by 4 ranch hands. His gaze shifted from Jacob to the bandaged leg of the stallion. Then back again. "I've been tracking this horse since dawn." Jacob quietly nodded. He was caught in abandoned barbed wire. Victor ignored the explanation. "You expect me to believe you just happened to find him?" Ben stepped forward. "My uncle." Jacob gently raised one hand, stopping him. Victor folded his arms. "Looks more like you stole him." The accusation hung heavily in the damp spring air. Jacob looked directly into Victor's eyes. "If I wanted your horse, I wouldn't still be standing here waiting for you." For several seconds, neither man moved. Rain dripped steadily from the roof of the old shack. The black stallion nudged Jacob's shoulder gently, almost seeking reassurance. Victor noticed. His expression hardened even more. Then another voice echoed across the valley. "That's enough." Everyone turned. Sheriff Owen Briggs rode toward them with 2 deputies close behind. The gray-haired sheriff calmly dismounted and surveyed the scene. His experienced eyes immediately found the stallion's injured leg, then the bloody barbed wire lying beside the shack. Finally, Jacob's muddy hands. "What happened here?" he asked. Before Victor could answer, Ben spoke. "My uncle saved him." Victor shook his head. Victor shook his head. "He says he did." Sheriff Briggs knelt beside the injured stallion. He carefully examined the fresh bandages. "They're well done," Jacob replied quietly. "They were the best I could manage." The sheriff looked toward one of the deputies. "Ride into town. Bring Dr. William Harper." The deputy nodded and galloped away. Nearly an hour passed before the elderly frontier veterinarian arrived in a wagon. Dr. Harper climbed down carrying his worn leather medical case. Without speaking, he carefully examined the stallion. He cleaned the wounds again, checked every tendon, ran experienced hands down the injured leg. When he finally stood, everyone waited. The old veterinarian removed his spectacles. This horse would have died if someone hadn't cut him free. Silence. He continued. The wounds were cleaned correctly. The bandages were properly applied. Then he looked directly at Victor Kane. Whoever treated this animal saved its life. Victor stared toward Jacob. His pride clearly battled with the truth standing before him. Finally, he walked toward the stallion. The magnificent black horse watched him quietly. Victor gently rested one hand against its neck. Then, without looking at Jacob, he spoke. "You did good work." It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't forgiveness. But for a man as proud as Victor Kane, it was something. Jacob simply nodded. "I'd do the same again." Victor untied the lead rope. "Come on, Thunder." The stallion didn't move. Victor tugged gently. "Come." Still nothing. The great black horse remained standing beside Jacob. Victor frowned. Another tug. The stallion shifted one step, then quietly walked back beside Jacob. Even Dr. Harper smiled. Looks like he remembers who helped him. Victor's ranch hands exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ben couldn't hide his grin. I think he likes Uncle Jacob better. Victor shot him a look. Ben immediately fell silent. The ranch owner tried once more. He stroked the stallion's neck. Thunder. The horse lifted its head. For a moment it seemed ready to follow. Then, it turned around completely, crossed the muddy ground, and gently rested its nose against Jacob Carter's shoulder. No one said a word. Even Sheriff Briggs seemed surprised. Jacob slowly scratched the stallion behind the ears. Easy, boy. The powerful horse stood perfectly still. Victor lowered the lead rope. For the first time in years, he looked genuinely confused. The sheriff quietly smiled beneath his thick gray mustache. Well, I believe the horse has made his opinion known. The storm clouds finally began breaking apart above the valley. Golden afternoon sunlight spilled across the pasture, but none of them realized the stallion's remarkable loyalty was only the beginning of a far greater mystery. Part 3. We stood in silence as the black stallion rested its nose against Jacob Carter's shoulder, completely ignoring the lead rope hanging from Victor Kane's hand. The spring storm had passed, and warm sunlight now stretched across the valley, turning the wet grass into fields of gold. No one could quite explain what had happened. A horse worth more than most ranches in the county had made its choice, and it had chosen Jacob. Victor Kane remained still for several moments. At last, he sighed quietly. I suppose Thunder can stay here until his leg heals. Ben Carter blinked in surprise. Victor Kane had not trusted Jacob Carter in 20 years. Yet here he was, leaving his most prized horse in the hands of the man he considered his greatest rival. Sheriff Owen Briggs adjusted his hat. Seems like the sensible thing. Victor looked at Jacob. I'll return in a few days. Jacob nodded once. I'll take care of him. The wealthy ranch owner mounted his horse and rode away with his men, disappearing beyond the eastern ridge. Ben watched them go. Then he looked at Jacob. Do you trust him? Jacob rested one hand against Thunder's neck. Sometimes people carry old anger longer than they should. Ben frowned. That doesn't answer the question. Jacob smiled faintly. No. It was not the answer Ben expected, but it was the truth. Over the next several days, Thunder recovered quickly. The great black stallion followed Jacob everywhere. When Jacob repaired fences, Thunder stayed nearby. When Jacob worked in the barn, Thunder stood outside the door. And each evening, as the sun settled behind the Rockies, the stallion waited quietly beside the porch. Even Ben had to laugh. I think he'd sleep inside the house if Aunt Hannah let him. Jacob smiled. Don't give him ideas. But while peace returned to the Carter Ranch, trouble was quietly growing elsewhere. One afternoon, Ben rode into Silver Creek to collect supplies from the general store. The little frontier town bustled with activity. Wagons rolled across the street. Children chased one another between storefronts. Ranchers discussed spring cattle prices. Ben finished loading flour, sugar, and coffee into his wagon when he heard voices behind the feed warehouse. He recognized one immediately. Victor Kane. Ben wasn't trying to listen, but the conversation stopped him cold. Victor sounded angry. I told you this wasn't supposed to happen. Another man answered quietly. Victor's ranch foreman. Earl Baxter. Age 50. Tall. Hard-faced. Trusted by everyone at the Kane Ranch. Ben moved closer without making a sound. Earl's voice carried through the narrow space between the buildings. No one was supposed to find the horse. Victor looked shocked. What are you talking about? Earl glanced around. The insurance company would have paid enough to cover the losses. Victor stared at him. You injured Thunder? Earl's silence was answer enough. Victor's face turned pale. You're out of your mind. Earl lowered his voice. It was business. Ben felt his heart pounding. He stepped backward. A loose board cracked beneath his boot. Both men turned. Ben didn't wait. He ran. Past the blacksmith, past the church, past the sheriff's office. He raced home as fast as his horse could carry him. So, evening shadows stretched across the Carter ranch when Ben rode into the yard. Jacob looked up from the corral. Ben? The boy jumped from his horse, breathing hard. Uncle Jacob? What is it? Ben told him everything. Every word. Every detail. Jacob listened quietly. When Ben finished, silence settled over the pasture. Thunder stood nearby, ears forward. Jacob looked toward the distant Kane ranch. So Victor didn't know. Ben shook his head. No. Jacob thought carefully, then nodded. We need Sheriff Briggs. Later that night, beneath the warm glow of lantern light inside the sheriff's office, Jacob repeated Ben's story. Sheriff Briggs listened without interruption. When Jacob finished, the sheriff folded his arms. If Ben heard correctly, then someone tried to destroy the horse for money. Jacob nodded. And Victor isn't the man responsible. The sheriff stood. That changes everything. For several moments, the old lawman remained silent. Then he looked directly at Jacob. Looks like your greatest enemy. Might not have been your enemy after all. At dawn the next morning, Jacob rode toward the Kane ranch. He intended to tell Victor the truth. But when he reached the ranch gate, he saw something that made him pull sharply on the reins. Sheriff Briggs was already there. And standing beside him, with 2 deputies holding his arms, was Earl Baxter. We watched Jacob Carter pull his bay horse to a stop outside the Kane ranch as the first light of morning spread across the Colorado Valley. Sheriff Owen Briggs stood beside the front gate with 2 deputies, and between them, his wrists bound, was Victor Kane's trusted foreman, Earl Baxter. Victor Kane stood several yards away, his face pale with disbelief. He looked far older than he had only a few days before. Jacob quietly dismounted. The sheriff nodded toward him. You came at the right time. You came at the right time. Jacob looked at Earl. It's true? Sheriff Briggs answered before the foreman could. It is. The lawman held up several folded papers. Ben's testimony gave us reason to search Baxter's office. He unfolded the documents. We found correspondence with an insurance agent. Victor stepped closer. His voice shook. You tried to collect money on Thunder? Earl lowered his head but said nothing. Sheriff Briggs continued. We also found wire cutters matching the cuts made on the abandoned fence. Silence settled across the ranch yard. Finally, Earl looked up. I never meant for the horse to survive. Victor stared at him in horror. You've worked for me for 15 years. You trusted me. I did. Earl gave a bitter laugh. And you never questioned a single ledger I handled. Victor's shoulders slowly dropped. Jacob realized something. The forged land records. The stolen boundaries. The lies that had divided neighbors for years. Perhaps they had never all begun with Victor Kane. Sheriff Briggs placed a firm hand on Earl's shoulder. Earl Baxter, you're under arrest for insurance fraud, animal cruelty, destruction of property, and conspiracy. The deputies quietly led him toward the waiting wagon. No struggle, no excuses, only silence. Took. For several long moments, neither Jacob nor Victor spoke. The spring breeze carried the scent of fresh grass across the valley. Finally, Victor looked at Jacob. I owe you an apology. Jacob remained quiet. Victor continued. I accused you of stealing my horse. I believed the worst of you. He lowered his eyes. And all the while, you were saving the one thing I valued most. Jacob looked toward the pasture where Thunder grazed peacefully. I didn't save him because he belonged to you. Victor nodded. I know. You saved him because he needed saving. The words seemed difficult for the proud rancher to admit. Jacob smiled gently. The horse never chose our quarrel. Victor couldn't help but smile in return. Seems he was wiser than both of us. For the first time in 20 years, the bitterness between them began to fade. Several weeks later, Thunder's injured leg had healed completely. The great black stallion once again galloped powerfully across the open pasture, his dark coat shining beneath the brilliant Colorado sun. Nearly the entire town gathered outside the Kane ranch that afternoon. Sheriff Briggs, the Carter family, neighboring ranchers, even the town preacher. Victor walked toward Jacob holding Thunder's reins. He stopped only a few feet away. "I've made my decision." He placed the lead rope into Jacob's hands. "Thunder belongs with you." Jacob looked surprised. "I can't accept him. You saved his life." Jacob slowly shook his head. "I didn't rescue him expecting a reward." Victor smiled. "I know. That's exactly why you deserve him." Jacob gently stroked Thunder's neck. The stallion quietly leaned against him. For a long moment, Jacob simply stood there. Then he carefully offered the lead rope back. Victor frowned. "You don't want him?" Jacob smiled. "I think we're asking the wrong question." Everyone watched quietly. Jacob unclipped the rope completely. Thunder stood free. He looked toward Victor, then toward Jacob. The great stallion slowly walked across the pasture. He stopped beside Jacob, lowered his head, and gently nudged his shoulder. Laughter and quiet applause spread through the gathered townspeople. Victor chuckled softly. "I suppose he's made his choice." Jacob laughed. "He certainly has." Ah. That evening, the golden sunset painted the Rockies in shades of amber and crimson. Jacob stood beside Thunder, near the split-rail fence, while Ben joined him. "You know," Ben smiled, "I never thought Mr. Kane would apologize." "Neither did I." Ben scratched Thunder behind the ears. "So, are you two friends now?" Jacob looked across the valley. Victor stood outside his own barn watching the sunset. He noticed Jacob, raised his hat. Jacob tipped his own hat in return. "Friends?" Jacob said thoughtfully. "Maybe not yet. But we've stopped being enemies. Sometimes that is where peace begins." Thunder snorted happily and trotted across the pasture, free beneath the wide Colorado sky. Jacob watched him disappear into the golden light. Some wounds heal with time. Others heal because someone chooses compassion over resentment. An injured stallion had carried two men back to the truth, not by choosing sides, but by reminding them that mercy is stronger than hatred. And as the sun disappeared beyond the mountains, Silver Creek witnessed something it had not seen in 20 years. Not the return of a horse, but the end of an old feud. The end